Directing a movie is a difficult job. You're in charge of tens or hundreds of millions of dollars and in command of hundreds or thousands of people over several years. If you're George Lucas or James Cameron, you're with your project from the idea to the post-release stress. It's no wonder then that so many directors end up taking decade-long breaks from the job. A lot of videos talk about specific movies a movie maker has made, including my own, but in this video I want to take a look at filmmakers who took very long breaks between projects, why they took them, and what they did during that time. Each of these filmmakers are either considered masters of their craft or are some of the greatest directors of all time. Each of them also took at least 10 years off between movies. George Lucas is the obvious starting point. The man made Star Wars and is so tightly coupled with it, some people might not realize that he only directed 4 of the 6 feature films that were made prior to the sale to Disney. But between 1977's Star Wars and 1999's The Phantom Menace, there was a 22-year-long gap between directed features. Lucas didn't direct either The Empire Strikes Back or Return of the Jedi. Empire was directed by Irvin Kershner, who taught Lucas while he was at USC and acted as a mentor, while Return was directed by Richard Marquand, who directed a movie, Eye of the Needle, that Lucas enjoyed. The reason that Lucas stopped directing for so long after Star Wars is pretty simple. He hated the job. Directing Star Wars was a grueling experience. First, it took him years to write the screenplay and get the funding necessary. He went to every studio in town, but they all said no until Fox stepped in. Even Disney said no at that time. Then, when he started, he ran into even more issues. The script changed day to day, and immediately upon arriving in the dry deserts of Tunisia for Tatooine, the region experienced its worst storm in half a century. The shoot barely started, and it was already behind schedule. While he was filming in Tunisia and then in England, things on the visual effects side back in the US were not moving smoothly. In fact, it was pretty dire. By the time filming wrapped, Lucas found that his VFX team had blown $1 million and came up with just 3 or 4 visual effects shots. It was bad enough to put him in the hospital, where the doctors told him that he needed to chill out, relax. That was literally the one thing that he could not do. There was too much money riding on this. To cap it all off, no one thought that the movie would be a success. And then, despite it being the biggest movie of 1977, George Lucas was sure of one thing. He never wanted to experience that again. He had written and directed Star Wars, but he wanted someone else to take over those responsibilities in the future. He wanted to focus on the story, but things would not work out that way. He had to do some writing on Empire after the death of the first screenwriter, Lee Brackett. Eventually, he hired Lawrence Kasdan to share writing duties. There are also the rumors that he basically ghost-directed Return of the Jedi, but how true those are is unclear. But as a very involved producer who was self-financing the movies, he was there pretty much all the time. Directing was something Lucas did out of necessity. He had stories he wanted to tell, that he wrote, that had to be done cheaply because he couldn't get big budgets. He literally could not afford to pay someone to direct a movie before Empire, so he took the duties onto himself. But even by his own admission, he wasn't much of a director. This is how he describes his directing process. Quote, "I manage action and cut and faster and more intense, and then, mostly, I sit there looking miserable and quiet," end quote. I'd like to say that this is tongue-in-cheek if it weren't for the fact that other actors corroborated it. According to Carrie Fisher, Lucas's main direction was, quote, "faster and more intense," end quote. Anthony Daniels, who played C-3PO, said, quote, "George is notorious for saying after take, do it again. Faster, more intensity. He certainly said that to me. Terrific, Tony. Can you do it again faster?" End quote. Lucas didn't even want to write or direct the prequels. He asked Lawrence Kasdan to write Phantom Menace, but Kasdan said no. He asked Steven Spielberg, Ron Howard, and Robert Zemeckis to direct it, and they also said no. But Lucas had stories he wanted to tell, and by God, he would tell them. So he took on the task himself, much to the chagrin of everybody else. That's not to say that he was just counting his money during the intervening years. Lucas helped turn ILM into the visual effects powerhouse and Skywalker Sound into the audio powerhouse. Star Wars continued its meteoric rise, and Lucas added Indiana Jones to his cap. He helped Akira Kurosawa get Kagemusha made and starred in some glorious Japanese commercials. He also helped other directors make their movies, like Paul Schrader's Mishima, A Life in 4 Chapters, Jim Henson's Labyrinth, and, of course, Howard the Duck. He started THX, which created standards for audio reproduction around the release of Return of the Jedi. He started Lucasfilm Games, which would become LucasArts. For a man who enjoyed the creative and business process more than the directing itself, it's not difficult to see why George Lucas took such a long gap. He had a lot of other interests, though in the end he eventually returned to directing for a few more years. Whether or not he will direct again remains to be seen. James Cameron has two very long pauses between movies, and so I had to choose the gap between Titanic and Avatar, or the gap between Avatar and Avatar: The Way of Water. I decided to choose both. After Titanic, Cameron was king of the world. He was the director of the first billion-dollar movie in Hollywood history, and the first of 3 $2 billion movies that he would direct. Cameron could have done anything he wanted at this point. He had the money, the resources, and access to Fox's massive checkbook. He decided not to pursue any of the mini projects on his table. A Planet of the Apes remake, T3, True Lies 2, Bright Angel Falling, Spider-Man, and others. Instead, as he so eloquently put it in his biography, the futurist, quote, "I've got my fuck you money and I can kind of step away for a while. My career's not going to go anywhere. I can do all the cool stuff that I've always wanted to do," end quote. And there were a lot of cool things he wanted to do. One was spending more time in the water. Cameron found peace in the ocean, saying, quote, "I usually go diving first to decompress by literally decompressing. I find the underwater world to be a great antidote to Hollywood. Nobody down there knows who you are. You're just a part of the food chain," end quote. Starting in 1998, he funded the creation of mini ROVs, or remotely operated vehicles, out of his own pocket. It took 3 years and $1 million to engineer a pair of them, Jake and Elwood, named after the Blues Brothers. Cameron almost lost Elwood on a dive to the Titanic after the movie was already released and had to risk Jake to get him back. But, in the words of Louis Abernathy, one of his friends that went along on the dive, quote, "The one blues brother doesn't desert the other blues brother," end quote. He started a production company with his brother, John, to work on deep-sea documentaries, and much of the output between Titanic and Avatar concerns water. He directed or co-directed 3 documentaries. The first was Expedition Bismarck, which followed an expedition to the sunken German battleship and reconstructed the events that led to its sinking. Then there was Titanic 3D Ghosts of the Abyss, which was about a dive to the wreck with the aforementioned Jake and Elwood. The third was Aliens of the Deep, filmed in IMAX 3D, which was about hypothermal vents and their ecosystems. This helped fuel his imagination for Avatar, as the ecosystem could hold answers to how life might develop on other planets or moons. In this period, he ended up doing dozens of dives. He also turned his interest toward the heavens and wanted to do a 3D IMAX film and miniseries that depicted how an accurate journey to Mars would look like. He even wanted to go into space and spend some time on the ISS. He got $30 million in commitments but needed more for insurance. However, the amount of training required plus the Columbia disaster nixed those plans. Exploration wasn't just a passing fad for Cameron. Over the years, he's logged more than 2,500 hours underwater, including more than 550 hours in diving helmets and more than 500 in submersibles. In his words, quote, "Exploration is not a luxury. It defines us as a civilization. It directly or indirectly benefits every member of society. It yields an inspiration dividend whose impact on our self-image, confidence, and economic and geopolitical stature is immeasurable," end quote. He wasn't entirely away from the fiction side of things either, though. He decided to try his hand at making television in the form of Dark Angel, which starred Jessica Alba. The show did decent enough numbers, but was cancelled after 2 seasons to be replaced with Firefly, which lasted just a single season. He also helped produce one movie at the time, Solaris, a remake of the Tarkovsky film directed by Steven Soderbergh. But by 2005, Cameron had spent almost a decade away from directing a feature film. Now, after exploring himself, he was ready to explore new, blue frontiers. He started work on Project 880, which is what would become Avatar, in an LA warehouse where Howard Hughes once built planes. He had started working on the treatment before Titanic was even released, but had to wait for the technology to catch up. Finally, it caught up, or was close enough to the point that he could develop it himself. When Avatar was released in 2009, James Cameron topped himself. It became the first $2 billion movie and, thanks to re-releases, is on the cusp of being a $3 billion movie. Of course, we all know what happened afterwards. Delay upon delay, Avatar: The Way of Water kept getting pushed back until it was finally released in 2022 and became another $2 billion movie. The second gap feels shorter but was longer than the previous gap by a single year. 13 years elapsed between the release of Avatar and Avatar: The Way of Water versus 12 years between Titanic and Avatar. Unlike the first gap, where he was exploring his interests in water, space, and 3D, the second gap was almost entirely aquatic. He executive produced a 3D movie about cave diving, went back to the Titanic wreck, and remastered the movie for a 3D release. But undoubtedly, the most important, the most storied event of this 13-year gap was his, at the time, record-setting solo descent into the Challenger Deep, the deepest part of the Mariana Trench. At 5:52 p.m. Eastern Time on March 26, 2012, Cameron descended 35,756 feet into the Pacific Ocean in a submersible dubbed Deep-Sea Challenger. While the top of the ocean has been well traversed, its depths are still a mystery to us, and Cameron figured that if anyone was going to explore them, it might as well be him. It was a 2-hour and 36-minute descent down the Challenger Deep, and each passing distance brought on more darkness. To contextualize the magnitude of the feat, the last descent was undertaken by Don Walsh and Jacques Piccard on January 23, 1960. They both descended in the Trieste and achieved a depth of 35,813 feet, though later measurements pegged the trench at 35,797 feet. Irrespective, Cameron's was only the second crewed descent and the first solo descent. While he was down there, Cameron also discovered new species of sea cucumber, squidworm, and giant single-celled amoeba. Because, of course, the man famous for his sci-fi movies would also discover creatures that should be in sci-fi movies. He also took on new filmic projects. The biggest one, in addition to his continuing work on the Avatar series, was, finally, seeing Alita Battle Angel to completion. He had begun work on Battle Angel after Guillermo del Toro showed him the joys of manga in the 1990s and registered a domain for the movie in 2000. After that, it was a long process of touch and go as he tried to balance it and Avatar. Finally, he found a director he could trust to work on the movie while he pursued Avatar and Avatar: The Way of Water, Robert Rodriguez. While the movie didn't exactly set the world on fire, Rodriguez and Cameron are hell-bent on doing another one. And considering how much money Cameron brings in, it's unlikely that anybody is going to tell him no. He was also active on the TV side and did one of my favorite James Cameron projects, James Cameron's Story of Science Fiction. Over 6 episodes, he interviewed a number of filmmakers and actors, including Christopher Nolan, Ridley Scott, Steven Spielberg, George Lucas, and Guillermo del Toro. The series explored the history of science fiction, and each discussed the books they read and the movies they watched that influenced their own work. As of 2010, he's also been adapting a film adaptation of The Last Train from Hiroshima. This would be an interesting break from all of his other feature films. It would only be the second book translation if we count Battle Angel, and the only non-fiction adaptation. He intends to do it after Avatar 3 though, so let's see if that's another long gap. If there's one person that shows the importance of taking breaks, it's James Cameron. He took 2 breaks to pursue his interests, and he was rewarded with 3 of the 5 highest-grossing movies of all time, each of which has now made more than $2 billion. Stanley Kubrick was a machine. Not a fast machine by any means, and no Ridley Scott, who is most certainly one of the most prolific filmmakers working today at 86. But Kubrick was an excruciatingly well-oiled machine, and was synonymous with perfectionism. As he got older, the time he took between movies got longer, but every movie he released was influential. The longest gap occurred between 1987's Full Metal Jacket and 1999's Eyes Wide Shut, his final film. Full Metal Jacket, like virtually all of his films, was a critical and commercial success. After its release, he didn't immediately begin working on Eyes Wide Shut as his next project. That was still a few years away. The delay, in his case, is pretty simple: perfectionism plus unrealized projects. There were some standouts during these years. One of them was Aryan Papers. Kubrick originally had an idea for a Holocaust movie in the 70s, but didn't begin trying to get it made until the 1990s, though his attempt would soon sputter out. He wanted to adapt Louis Bigley's Wartime Lies, which is about, quote, 2 members of an upper-middle-class Jewish family, a young woman and her nephew, who avoid persecution as Jews by assuming Catholic identities, end quote. But he stopped working on it after Schindler's List. Kubrick's wife also mentioned that he got depressed during the research process, which might have been another reason. He reached out to Umberto Eco about adapting the 1988 novel Foucault's Pendulum, which Eco declined but later regretted. He also considered adapting All the King's Men, but again decided not to pursue it. The most significant project, though, was AI, Artificial Intelligence, which he worked on developing for several years and which he referred to as Pinocchio. Kubrick acquired the rights to the short story it was based on, Super Toys Last All Summer Long, by Brian Aldiss, in the 70s and hired numerous writers to come up with a story and screenplay. One of those writers was Aldiss himself, who Kubrick ended up firing over creative differences. Kubrick would hire Ian Watson, of whom Aldiss said, quote, "Not only did the bastard fire me, he hired my enemy instead," end quote. Watson was able to deliver a satisfactory story and screenplay in 1991, but Kubrick ran into another issue: CGI. The technology was still in its nascency, and Kubrick didn't think that he could get the effects that he wanted. He would turn his attention to other projects until he saw Jurassic Park and the effects that ILM was able to create. He hired Dennis Muren, a 9-time Academy Award winner, though the two soon parted ways as Kubrick was not impressed with the work or how expensive ILM was. As Kubrick turned his attention to working on Eyes Wide Shut as his next project, he wanted to give the duties of AI, artificial intelligence, to Steven Spielberg, who had already impressed him. Spielberg declined at the time, saying Kubrick should do it instead, but after he passed away, his widow, Christiane Kubrick, asked Spielberg to direct it. Spielberg took it on, and the movie was dedicated to Kubrick's lasting memory and impact. Eyes Wide Shut had a famously long production, taking 400 days to shoot, which, of course, added more than a year to the already significant gap between it and Full Metal Jacket. While not particularly well reviewed at the time, it has risen in esteem since. Kubrick would die just 6 days after presenting the final cut. David Lean is a director's director. Besides Akira Kurosawa and Stanley Kubrick, he's probably one of the most important, influential directors of the 20th century. Steven Spielberg, Stanley Kubrick, Ridley Scott, Martin Scorsese, George Lucas, John Woo, Christopher Nolan, and Peter Jackson have all cited him as an influence, which is particularly notable in The Lord of the Rings, perhaps the most epic production of the 20th century. And David Lean is the man whose name is synonymous with the word epic. In Lean's case, the hiatus was a self-inflicted wound that took a long time to recover from. But before we get into it, it's worth understanding a small bit of why Lean was such an impressive director. Lean started as a film lover before graduating to becoming a film editor. The cutting room was a good place to get an education in film. You got to see all the shots the director took and helped craft the final film that people would see in theaters, building an eye for what worked and what didn't. Lean had cut more than 20 movies before directing his first feature, In Which We Serve, by Noel Coward, the first of 4 critically and commercially successful collaborations with the playwright. In the 12 years between Brief Encounter, the fourth of the Coward collaborations, and The Bridge on the River Kwai, Lean directed several more features that were well received critically, though not always commercially. Brief Encounter, Great Expectations, and Summertime were certainly good enough to get him the Academy Award nomination for Best Director. In total, he would receive 7 Best Director nominations and 2 wins. One of those wins came in the form of The Bridge on the River Kwai, his epic war film, which would propel him to the mountaintop and make him synonymous with the word epic. Lean worked with 2 screenwriters that were blacklisted in Hollywood, Carl Foreman and Michael Wilson, to help craft the highest-grossing movie of 1957 and what is considered one of the best movies ever made. He repeated a similar feat 5 years later with Lawrence of Arabia, also considered one of the best films ever made. The story was the same for his third epic, Dr. Zhivago. Things took a turn after his next movie, 1970's Orion's Daughter, though it's somewhat inexplicable. The film, which is about an Irish woman that has an affair with a British officer, was a commercial success and cinched several Academy Award nominations, including 2 wins, but was lambasted by critics. It might be the case that expectations were just too high. It's like expecting J.R.R. Tolkien to write another genre-defining work after he had already written The Lord of the Rings. Orion's Daughter received a series of negative reviews, including 2 out of 4 stars from Roger Ebert, who called it a, quote, lush and overblown self-indulgence in which David Lean has given us a great deal less than meets the eye, end quote. But in the same review, he recognizes that every director will have some duds, and when it comes to a great director like Lean, even those are worth seeing. In his words, quote, I have a friend who says a new David Lean movie is like a new Picasso. It may not be a great Picasso, he says, but by God, it's a Picasso and worth seeing for that reason, if for no other. I suppose that's true of Lean and all great directors. Their work is interesting just because they've signed it, and the failures help to illuminate the successes, end quote. Lean, however, took the critical assault to heart and convened a meeting with the National Society of Film Critics at the Algonquin Hotel in New York. This was his mistake and what led to the 14-year hiatus between Orion's Daughter and A Passage to India. In Lean's words, quote, they just took the film to bits. It really had such an awful effect on me for several years. You begin to think that maybe they're right. Why on earth am I making films if I don't have to? It shakes one's confidence terribly, end quote. For 2 hours, he was mercilessly criticized by the meeting he convened and, by the end, decided that if people didn't want to see his films, perhaps he shouldn't make them. For several years, that's how it was. But Lean started to get the itch in the late 70s and began working on a pair of movies about the mutiny on the Bounty, but couldn't get the financing for them. He was able to condense it into one movie, but would leave the project eventually. He then started working on what would become his comeback film, A Passage to India. He tried to do the project since 1960, but for one reason or another was not able to see it to completion. Now he would. Adapted from E.M. Forster's novel of the same name, the movie is, like Lean's earlier epics, considered a masterpiece and got 11 Academy Award nominations, including Best Director, Best Film Editing, and Best Adapted Screenplay for David Lean himself. A Passage to India would end up being Lean's final film, though he was in pre-production on an adaptation of Joseph Conrad's Nostromo, as well as Empire of the Sun, which he would later drop and give to Steven Spielberg. Unfortunately, David Lean would pass away in 1991, leaving behind a very well-respected legacy. Even directors need a break between movies. Some only take a few years, and some, like the aforementioned Ridley Scott, jump from film to film as though they're trying to make up for lost time. Whatever the case, when the director is someone like George Lucas, David Lean, James Cameron, or Stanley Kubrick, it's always worth the wait.